Welcome back to the Gen X Experience. This is episode 47. And today we are continuing our two-part series on divorce, which is our topic for the month. Last episode, we talked about dealing with divorce as a woman. Today, we're going to talk about navigating divorce from the other side of the gender aisle as a man. And I have a really great guest who is a certified divorce coach, among other things. And we're going to talk about all kinds of different things that men need to know, why it's okay to ask for help, why you need to do the work, how to navigate custody and talking to your kids, boundaries, dating, all those things. So before we get into the podcast, let me share a little bit about my guest, Justin Milrad. Justin Milrad is a certified divorce coach, author of You 2.0, Transform Your Life After Divorce, and the founder of Reclaim and Reboot, a platform dedicated to helping individuals rebuild and thrive after the end of a marriage. A proud father of three, Justin brings both personal insight and professional expertise to his work, having firsthand experience with the complexities of divorce, co-parenting, and rebuilding his life. Today, he works with high achievers, parents, and anyone navigating the emotional, financial, and personal challenges of divorce, helping them reclaim their confidence, rebuild their lives, and design a bold, fulfilling future. Before founding Reclaim and Reboot, Justin built a successful career as an entrepreneur, including serving as the CEO of a mental health treatment program where he developed the deep listening skills, empathy, and resilience that now define his coaching approach. He also has an MBA with a background in financial planning. So he is a multi-passionate guy, and you're going to get to hear more about him in this episode. So without further ado, let's get into my episode with Justin. So Justin, thank you so much for coming on the podcast to talk about divorce directed towards the male perspective. I think it's important to talk about it because I don't feel like, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, I don't feel like a lot of conversation around divorce or getting support is directed towards men. I feel like a lot of it is directed towards women. And I think that's kind of a detriment to men because it's okay to talk about your feelings and the stuff that you're going through. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, there's no question about it. First of all, thank you for having me on the podcast. For men, it's a emotional earthquake, and we struggle a little different. It's true what they say, men are from Mars, women are from Venus. Women are much better at seeking support and help, and we're better at internalizing it. We go through a silent struggle. We're often socialized to suppress our emotions, or as we're told, to man up. Divorce for us has a lot to do with our identity. It can make us feel like a personal failure. It's a real, true path to isolation and stagnation. And, there's lots of research out there that shows that divorced men have significantly higher rates of depression, anxiety, suicide, alcohol and drug abuse than divorced women.
I mean, I'm not surprised just because growing up Gen X, I have a brother, and whenever he got to a certain age and he would start being upset or crying, it was like, oh, you got to stop. You're a boy, you're a man. You can't, are not supposed to cry or show their emotions. And that, there's nothing wrong with showing your emotion. And I think it makes it harder when you get older, because then when you go through something like a divorce, you don't know how to deal with emotions, whereas women were just allowed to express them most of the time.
It's really hard to move on if you don't have an opportunity to deal with your emotions. And I think for men, it's a double loss. And I'm not saying that men are losing more than women. We all suffer and struggle in our own ways, but we lose more than just a spouse. We often lose our primary support system. Often it's our home and consistent contact with our children. We are feeling squeezed and we're living bereavement. And I think there's also another challenge. I think being part of Gen X, men are still considered to be the provider, or at least we think so in our own head. And there's a confusing, dynamic in marriages because women, thankfully through lots of, hard work and getting out in front in the public, in the workspace, there's a much stronger dynamic and more balance. But then when you go back to the home, men feel like we're failing because we can't handle the same load that many women can. And I think there's a real resiliency on top of that, and something that I find with a lot of my clients, the female clients will say, well, my husband can't handle the kids, or my husband doesn't know how to cook or do laundry or all these sorts of things. And that may be true. It's not true in every family. And sometimes roles are can be and are reversed. But it doesn't mean, men are incompetent. It just means that we have to learn a new skill the same way that women have to learn some skills that are traditionally done by, men in the households. It takes work and it's a lot of change. And the first year is harder than future years in most cases. We're developing and building new muscle.
I know there's always a time frame for different types of grief, and divorce is obviously a grief journey. Do you notice, you said the first year is the hardest. When do you feel like men get to a point where they're like, okay, I'm not, I'm okay with this. I've let go some of the grief, the anger. I'm ready to kind of like move on with my life or adapt to my new normal?
For men, there are 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And it's not linear. Sometimes you'll be in 3 of those stages in one day. And it really depends how we do the work. So by doing the work, that means lots of introspection. That means identifying what was working, what wasn't working, where we contributed, but also defining the life that you want. And in my own divorce, we were 3 years in, and I was playing the victim the entire time until I hired a divorce coach. And then the divorce coach helped me with radical acceptance, acknowledging where I was and the world that I'm currently in. And also to see the opportunity of how I can kind of recalibrate my life and create a life that I love and be, happier, a better father, a better person, healthier. In many ways, kind of looking back, even though I never wanted to get divorced, this was a blessing because I was able to get off the hamster wheel of life. I was able to look and evaluate, where I was and to make changes. And, fast forward, I'm happy to say I'm in an amazing relationship. It's almost 3 years. We're engaged to get married. My kids are doing well. I'm very happy. I'm doing something that I really love. So divorce doesn't have to be, doom and gloom. It could be, the most amazing release. And what I think is really important for everyone to know and understand is divorce is typically between 2 good humans who, intended to get married, have kids, live life together. And at some point, the marriage broke down. And that doesn't mean that, they're not good humans. It just means that the marriage ran its course, or some trust was broken, or something happened. But your life isn't over. In fact, it could just be beginning. And, we're very young. When we get married, our brains often aren't totally formed, and we have life experiences and we change. The original institution of marriage was when there was an average life expectancy of 25,
Right.
But now people are being married for, 50, 60, 70 years, which is incredible. Well, you got to put a lot of effort in to make sure that that marriage is working and that you're both happy. And there's a lot of people who are in, unhappy marriages, but they choose to do nothing about it.
Yeah. And, we only have so much time living on, as a person living. And yes, divorce is hard. I think asking yourself, would I rather stay in this marriage and be unhappy the rest of my life? Or would I rather, not be married and have a chance to start my life over and find my happiness and my joy? And I think that's for a lot of people, it's a tough question to ask. Do you think men struggle with that more because of the feeling of I'm the provider, I might not get to see my kids, so they will stay because it's just that alternative sounds better, even if they're unhappy?
Yeah. And I think men think more about how they are in the moment. And, they're really running fast on that hamster wheel of life, and they don't really spend a lot of time thinking about it. Whereas I think women, they spend a lot more time thinking about the here and now and the future and what was. And, it's a challenge. What's interesting is 70% of divorces, are initiated by women.
Yeah. And now it's like a trend. My last interview, I learned about the gray divorce.
Yep.
because we're living longer, as you said, like people are like, oh, I don't want to spend another, I spent 30, 40 years with a person. I don't want to spend another 10, 20 years. Yeah. It's interesting that that's become like a new, I hate to say trend, but I mean, that's really the best word for it.
I was with a client this morning, and, she's in her mid 50s, and, she wasn't expecting to get divorced ever. And one day her husband came home and said, I don't want to be married anymore. And, she just went along with it. She didn't fight it. And, she said to me, I've done so much introspection. And she's like, I'm really loving my life now. I love my freedom. I love dating. She now met a guy that she really likes, but she's like, I really like my life. And she felt that she was serving her husband, and taking care of the kids, and really lost part of herself. So that, this was a nice clean break, and she turned her pain into fuel. And now she's living a life on her terms, one that she's very, happy about. And she's creating, a plan for the next 20 or 30 years.
That's amazing. Divorce can be a new start. It doesn't have to be the end of everything. So since men do tend to, well, I mean, Gen X in general, we are very bad at asking for help, but men aren't great at asking, or seeking out help or going to a therapist or, and you said you have to do the work. If someone is thinking about, okay, I need some help, but I'm not ready for therapy, what would you recommend they do? Pick up your book and your workbook and start with that first?
Pick up my work and my book and my workbook. But like, in all honesty, I had never heard of a divorce coach before. And I found out about one, literally 8 weeks before we went to trial. And, that person was able to flip my attitude. A coach focuses on the here and now and the future, which, therapists do as well. But I think therapists focus more on regulation, understanding your past trauma. And I think, if you can afford it, I think using both a coach and a therapist is the best, opportunity. A lot of coaches offer free 30-minute consultations. You can get a lot done in 30 minutes, and you don't have to be with a coach for the rest of your life. You could do 6-10 sessions and be in great shape. And one of the other things is people don't want to spend more money, after they're spending $500 an hour on an attorney.
Right.
But if they're using a coach, they're actually saving a ton of time and a ton of money, because they're going to be prepared when they talk to their attorney for their highest and best use. And, I read something this morning that I thought was really interesting. And it basically said that if you show up to your attorney with your numbers, your budgets, and understanding what your assets are and everything kind of laid out, you're going to save 40 to 50% of your legal fees. Because
Wow.
a big part of it is just putting together that financial picture. Because there's two parts of a divorce, division of assets, which is anything that's marital. You divide that, and the laws change depending on where you live, but it's either 50-50 or it's what's called equitable, distribution, which is fair-ish. And then if you have kids, there's custody. And the thing about divorce is there's a start date and there's an end date. So eventually you're going to get your divorce decree stamped by the court and you're officially divorced. Well, that's all, great if that's what you're looking for, but you haven't done the work of setting yourself up for the future. And, the number one question I get mostly from women, when they start talking to me is, am I going to be okay? Well, you don't know if you're going to be okay if, number one, you don't have the numbers, but number two, if you haven't defined, what is your life going to look like? What are the values you want to live by? How old are your kids? So you've really got to plan for the short term, the medium term, and the long term. And I think that's what's missing.
No, that's a really great point to bring up because, yeah, a lot of people, they're so angry and hurt that they go in emotions first and kind of leave the thinking part out. But yeah, the better, if you do the work and get your emotions in check, and then do the financials and think about all the things, the present and the future, then maybe it doesn't have to be so ugly and messy. Not saying that it won't be, because you never know how each person is going to act. But yeah, being prepared it's always a good thing. So speaking of, so let's talk about children establishing custody. Historically, usually women, have more of the custody. Men are either not seeing their kids. I know that's changed a little bit, but they're not seeing their kids that often. How do you, make sure, I mean, it's a negotiation, I understand that, but as a man, that's something you need to think about before. Like, how often do I want to see my kids? How old are my kids? What is the plan? So how do you mentally prepare for that discussion?
I think you need to approach divorce as amicably as possible. And I always say, and it's actually the title of my next book, which is almost done, divorce recovery is a single player game. So it's not about winning in the divorce, because no one wins in the divorce, but you can win in life. And if you've decided to have kids and you're a good parent, you want to be in their lives, because every kid needs a father, every kid needs a mother. And if you can split the time 50-50 and make that work, then that's what you should do. And frankly, many of the judges don't want inequitable distribution of time when it comes to custody, because they know that kids need both parents. And the other amazing thing, and when I tell clients this, it blows their mind. But there's research that says that if you have a good co-parenting relationship with your ex, it's as if you never got divorced in terms of the damage that's done for your kids. So what damages kids are bad co-parenting relationships where the parents are fighting, where they're trying to use their kids as messengers, or they're using their kids to parent them, and to share the problems of the parent. Like, those are things that can really damage a kid's growth. They shouldn't be dealing with that at this age. So it's really important to, number one, be on the same page when it comes to the kids, and don't expect an apology. It'll be nice if you get one, especially if you were wronged, but you may never get one. And you want to focus on living the best life you can and winning in life, not in the divorce. You need to make sure that you have strong boundaries, with your ex. You focus on the business of your kids, and the business doesn't end when they turn 18. The business will always go on, marriage, happy occasions, sad occasions, and kids. Your lives are going to be intertwined if you have kids forever, So I think it's really important to try and be on as close of the same page as possible, but also as the man, don't assume that you're not going to get 50%, but you gotta level up. You gotta improve your skill set. And that means, some things that you may not be comfortable with, you learn. And, I will say, even though I went through an absolutely horrible divorce, and I think it was really the attorneys that, turned it, into a war. My ex and I are, I think we're doing a great job co-parenting. In fact, I give us an A+ because we're on the same page, and we try and have as much consistency between the two households as possible. We don't withhold, the kids from one parent. We let them talk to the other parent if they want to stay at, the other parent's house. In many cases we'll do that, and we accommodate each other. And, we ask ourselves the North Star question: how will this benefit or hurt my children, before we make any decision?
Yeah, I think that's a good reminder because having dated divorced men who have kids, I have noticed challenges with boundaries also. We'll talk about this in a little bit, but like bringing their drama and their trauma into another relationship and just bad mouthing the ex, I'm like, that is a huge red flag and a turnoff. But speaking of, dealing with your kids, how do you, because sometimes kids, you hear about, kids are like, well, I'm going to play both parents, and, I can get this from this parent and that from that parent, or you have the kid calling the other parent, complaining about the parent. How do you navigate that as a parent? Like, because I feel like there has to be some boundaries with your kids as well. So they're not, if mom made me mad, I'm not going to constantly call dad, or vice versa. How do you navigate that?
Yeah. So first of all, there's no perfect formula, and you're always going to be adjusting. So, I think what's really important is to acknowledge that every one of your kids is going to be different, and you may have to treat them a little different. You're going to try and create as much consistency as possible, but if you can create some similar routines in both houses, like perhaps bedtime, television and computer chores, respect, and they don't all have to be the same, but the more consistency, the less confused your kids are going to be, and then you have to hold, certain boundaries in place. For example, as a parent, you tell one another, I am not going to badmouth you in front of the kids, and that whatever discussions we have should be age appropriate, because, what happens at 9 years old is different than what happens at 16. And the kids don't need all the details. Telling your child that there was infidelity can cause damage, and it's a lot for you to hold on to, but there's probably a more appropriate time. So just, you can tell the kids, mommy and daddy, decided that we're no longer, meant to be married, but we love you so much, and we both care about you, and we both want what's best for you. And then I think showing your kids by demonstrating. My ex and I, we go to my kids' sport games. We sit together, 9 out of 10 times, because it's important for our kids to see that. We call each other, to talk about the logistics around the kids in front of the kids. So I think if you can have that good relationship with your ex. I think that's really important, and it's important for your kids to see. But you also have to have a firewall. There's certain things that they don't need to know or that you don't need to do. And there's, a communication method called BIF, which I like to use a lot. It's brief, informative, friendly, and firm. And, when you think about how you communicate with your ex, you're not supposed to be good friends with your ex. Like, some people may disagree, but listen, you got divorced for a reason. And, it's probably not healthy to have a really strong, buddy friendship, but you need to be friends for the sake of the kids, so you don't have to tell them about your weekend, you don't have to tell them about dates that you've been on. There are unique situations where that does happen and it works out fine, but, I'd say that's more the exception.
Yeah. So sometimes, exes do not have good relationships or don't want to have a good relationship, and, they have kids, and it makes it a challenge for them to get along. Is there, something they can do to try to leave that anger and just is it just focus on the kids and not focus on what this person did to you, how you feel about them? If you just focus on the kids, do you think that makes it easier to just kind of put the other stuff in the background?
Well, I think there's two tracks. Number one is you got to focus on the kids, and you have to be on the same page about wanting what's best for the kids. And I think most parents are. Sometimes there's very different parenting styles, which makes it more complicated. And then at the same time, you gotta, you need to work with someone, whether it's a divorce coach and or a therapist or someone else, to work on your own stuff, to get over the anger, move past resentment, and to build up your skill set. And a lot of it is changing your state of mind. So, I'll give you a perfect example. We don't know what we don't know. And, when our divorce was a week away from going to court, my attorney, who I liked very much, told me I have to take this court mandated parenting online course. It was either like 4 or 6 hours. And I took it, and it was excellent. And I wish the minute I filed for divorce that they said, if you're going to co-parent with your ex, you need to take this course right then and there, because information is knowledge. There's a lot of evidence that I think if you were to tell two parents at the beginning of the process, here's a good divorce, here's a bad divorce, here's the outcome of a good divorce, here's the outcome of a bad divorce, most people are fairly rational, and they don't have to like one another to make good decisions. And, I think that is a real challenge. And when I work with my clients, I have sessions, if it makes sense, with both spouses. So to talk about co-parenting early on, but also when the divorce is final, I try and have a session with both spouses to say, okay, here's what the future looks like. And if you start right, you stay right. And here's things that are going to come up. And also in the process, there's things, if you go to mediation, you want to make sure you address all the big topics, but also the small topics. Things that your lawyer likely isn't going to bring up, like, who pays for the first car? How do you split it? Or, if my kids want to go to, on a school trip out of the country, how do you split that? Or, if, my child has a certain health condition that comes up in the future, how do we deal with that? So the more that you can resolve in the negotiation, the less stress you have later. And I think this is so, so important because, if something comes out of left field, let's say you have 4-year-old kids, twins right now, and in 12 years, your ex says, oh, we have to buy them a car. Well, guess what? I never thought about that. I never saved up for that. And now you're putting me in a crappy position because I couldn't prepare. And that's when, anger happens, when there are unforeseen circumstances that could have probably been predicted.
Yeah, no, that's true, because you hear stories, or because people forget that your kids are not going to be the age they are when you get divorced. They're going to grow up, or maybe they already are grown up, and they're still going to have things come up. And it's important to think about all this stuff.
Yeah, there are major differences between 3 and 7, 8 and 14, and 15 to 18. They're very different kids.
So if you think about everything and start from the beginning, being on the same page, that you can weather whatever changes happen. Speaking of changes, at some point, some divorced men and women, but they think about dating. And like I said, having dated some divorced men who I think could use your help very much because like they have not dealt with their anger, or they want a mommy and that's not my job. How do you decide like when it's right to date, like that you're ready, not just like, okay, I need to, get some, because that's not really dating, versus like, I want to have a relationship and remember that like I'm divorced and I don't want to take that into the next relationship, because as a single girl, as I said, I don't, if you constantly bash your ex, like I start to think that you're the problem and that you're going to be a problem dating me. And also I don't want to keep hearing about your past because I don't want to keep talking about mine. So what is some advice you give, like when to know to start to date and how to make sure you're not just constantly talking about your divorce and your ex?
Yeah. So, I think the first thing I want to say is a lot of people are terrified about dating. It's kind of like, I haven't dated in 20 years. I don't know how to use the apps. I will say dating was one of the most exciting things, and I really enjoyed it, but it really takes, a frame of mind, and you have to do the work. The other thing that I notice a lot is you end up picking someone just like your ex. And, second marriages have a 70% divorce rate. And there's probably a good reason for that. So I know this sounds cliche, but doing the work on yourself and doing the work on your past relationships is really important. So I always say before you go date, you can go out and have some fun, but be transparent, with the person, because sometimes that's all people want. They just want some companionship and, they want to have a little bit of fun, which is perfectly fine. As long as they're consenting adults, that's good. But when you start doing the introspective work and you're finding out who you are, what you need, what didn't work, what would you like, and you do that with your ex, you start dating yourself. And that just really means get to know yourself. And then, some people say, and this sounds creepy, but I don't mean it that way, date your kids too. Like get to know them. Like I had a great relationship with my kids, but I really know them well now. And we have a special, special relationship. And I think when you're feeling good about where your kids are and where you are and when you're, what you're looking for, then you can start dating. And for some people, I'd say don't start dating for at least 6 months, but probably a year. And then, there's do's and don'ts on dates. Don't go in talking about your ex. That, I know from working with many of my clients that that's the easiest way to turn someone off. Like that's your past, move on, give it honorable mention, don't talk badly about your ex. Just say, if they're a good mother, good father, acknowledge that. I learned a lot. We had a good marriage until we didn't, and boom, I've moved on. And then how to date, I think is, I like going back to old fashioned dating where you get excited about it and, you pick an outfit, you wash your car, you come up with a plan and go have fun with it. If you're nervous, go look up, on Google, look up 20 questions to ask a new date. There's so much interesting technology. You can even, if you're really nervous, role play with a friend.
No, it's great advice. Yeah, and yes, Google is free. Please use. As a single girl, there's so many times I've had guys like, I don't know where we should go. I'm like, there's the internet, and when we didn't have the internet, y'all were able to figure out where to take us. Try to, and this, I mean, it applies to women too, but like, put your best foot forward.
Yeah, it looks good when you do your research. When you don't, and you don't have an opinion, that's a real turnoff. I know you're in Atlanta. It's either free or very low cost Jewish website called Jewlove. They do a great job, matching people, because it's a mitzvah, as they say.
Right. I did not know, because I haven't been here that long. I did not know about that website, but I'll have to look into it because I've taken a break from dating.
And I just want to say one other thing, matchmaker. I used a matchmaker. My current fiance is the first date I went on, and there's a science behind it. We're all very busy, and some of the apps are amazing and some of them aren't. And I never used them. I met my first wife or my ex on JDate, but that was back in 2006. But a matchmaker is a great way to meet someone. They use the science, they have data, they do personality tests, they talk you about date, they coach you through dating,
which I think a lot of people need, not just Gen X, but everybody, because the apps The apps they're not great. Like I remember when online dating first started, it was a website or websites, and you had to make the effort. It was more effort required. Now it's just like swipe, 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 and it's like an ego boost. And if you're not serious about dating, just don't
Yeah.
do it.
And you only need one, right? You
Right.
only need one match, and sometimes you're going to go on 20 dates till you find that match, and when it's meant to be, it'll be.
Yes, exactly. And matchmaking is an old school, I mean, not just in Judaism, but like in other religions as well. I mean, there's the shows on Netflix that
Yep.
I know there's a Jewish one, but there was another one that was the Indian matchmaker. And I mean, that culture has a lot of arranged marriages, which most of them, I think, work out. Although I don't think her track record was very good, but it's an interesting show to see how they work. Do you find a difference, speaking of like divorced men with kids versus divorced men who are child free, either, by choice or they didn't have kids? Do they have different challenges, or do you think it's easier for them or harder for them when it comes to just like navigating divorce? Because like when you don't have kids and you get divorced, like the chances of you seeing that person are pretty much nothing. So do you think they have it easier, harder? It doesn't matter.
Well, if there are no kids, it's much easier to have a clean break. You can have the clean break in the same city. There's a good chance someone's going to move out of state at some point. But the minute you have kids, if you want to be an involved parent, which, I don't know how you can't be, it definitely complicates things.
Yeah. And I think that was probably why, divorced men with kids, it's a lot harder for them to kind of move past things and let go, because you're still constantly reminded of your marriage and what happened because you're constantly seeing your ex because you have kids. So,
Yeah. Listen, it's hard not to be upset or to get jealous if you see the other spouse moving on. And, I need to note this financially, it is so destructive. Women are, on average, 41% worse off, and men are 27% worse off. And, it makes it very, very hard because not only is your whole world being blown up, your entire ecosystem, but now financially, you want to do more for your kids, but you don't necessarily have the means. So spending time, quality time, engaging with them is really the best return on investment.
yeah, because that's what they remember, is the time
Yeah.
you spent with them, not the stuff that you bought them. I mean, I don't remember things there's a few things I remember my parents bought me when I was little because of like a bike or something. The rest of the stuff I couldn't tell you.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I just want to tell one story. Do you know what a labubu is?
Yeah. Yes, I do.
I actually have one here. So I took my daughter to California this summer. My 9-year-old. This is a labubu.
Oh my gosh. Did you go to, what is it, the Fun Pop store or whatever? There's a certain like
Pop Mart.
Pop Mart.
Pop
That's
Mart.
it. Yeah. Pop Mart.
And I took her to California, and I was so excited because I lived there for 3 years, and I wanted to show her Universal and Disney and Rodeo Drive and Hollywood. And all she wanted to do was to go, run around the city and try and find Labubus, because back then they were really hard to get. And, I was talking with a friend of mine, who grew up in a household where her parents were also divorced. And I said, I want to show her everything in California, and she wants these, Labubus. I don't understand. And my friend said to me, you know what? I had a similar experience. My dad took me to California, and, back then I think it was like Cabbage Patch Dolls or something, and she's like, and I remember him going from toy store to toy store for me for Cabbage Patch Dolls. And that's all I remember. I don't remember anything else. So I changed the itinerary of the trip. For days on end, we were driving to San Diego, and parts of Northern California and Southern California to pick up Labubus. And
Yeah,
she hasn't forgotten that.
Yeah. No, that's awesome.
She'll never forget.
Yeah. I mean, it's fun when you talk about toy stores. My dad was like a big kid, and going to toy stores with him was more fun than my mom, because he would just be like, what do you want? We just going on every aisle, and he would just get us so much stuff. So
in his element.
Yeah, exactly. He was probably won his half the toys himself. So let's, before we like wrap this up and talk about your books and your support group and your podcast, I wanted to ask a question on behalf of people who are not divorced, or their family members or friends, and especially guy friends. Like, how do you help your friend? How do you be there for your friend without giving unsolicited advice, telling them to like stick with it, or like how do you be there without being annoying?
I love this question so much because, we lose about 40% of our friends instantly. And that's a real statistic. I saw that this morning quoted. And, it's not really the friend's fault. They don't know how to show up. They don't know how to be supportive to you, and you will lose friends. I lost a really good friend. And, when I brought it up to him about how I just felt he wasn't really there for me, he said, listen, I love you like a brother. He said, but, this was a couple friend, but my wife is close, with your ex. And I just don't want to deal with the fighting because I know she's going to make me pick. So I'm sorry. And that broke my heart. So what can you do to support your friends? Number one, get educated to learn, about some of the pain. I'm going to do a shameless plug of my podcast, The Conscious Divorce, but it's really focused on emotion. And I'm actually going to do a episode soon on how to be a friend. You can just go to your friend and check in and say, listen, I really don't know how to support you, but I want you to know that I'm here. If you ever want to talk, you want to go away, you want to grab a meal or a drink, I am here for you. How can I support you? Just be there. And I think that will go a long way. Because when you're going through a divorce or you're divorced, sometimes you feel like a leper, and it's not that people don't love you or they don't care. They totally do, or at least most people do. They just don't know how to approach it. So the easiest thing for them to do is to just ignore it. So, your social life is all part of an ecosystem. And, some of your friends, if they're like plants, they'll wither. Others, you'll find new ones and you have to cultivate new growth. And you have to work hard to find new communities and new ways of getting support. We talked a little bit earlier about synagogues, synagogues, community, sports. I started, training for a triathlon, and there's a whole new community. So the worst thing you can do is be alone during a divorce. That's where the pain really starts to multiply. Mm-hmm. And then on the positive side, if you start doing good things, then it compounds. And also seek out veterans of divorce. There are a lot of people who've gone through divorce and they're doing great now. Some stay single, some choose to remarry, but they need to be your guides and your mentors. And, there was a friend of mine here in the Jewish community who he was about 15 years older than me. And, he went through a terrible divorce years ago and he's doing great now and he's very happy. And I'd meet with him and he'd coach me, just as a friend. And he gave me incredible, incredible advice.
I love that.
And then I guess one last point, don't be afraid to be vulnerable. With your true friends, be honest about what you're going through. Yes. They don't need to solve things, but, vulnerability is the key to deep connection. It's how you build support systems that can sustain you. And guess what? Lots of people are going through their own stuff, so you can support one another. It was interesting. Last year I posted on Facebook that I decided to become a divorce coach and that, I had gone through a divorce because many people didn't know. And I think it was 22 people private message me about their own relationship challenges, either having gone through divorce or they're thinking seriously about it, or, there's infidelity or shambles. So, other people are experiencing pain. And sometimes when you're being vulnerable, you're not supporting yourself, you're also supporting someone else. So it's a win-win.
Yes. And if you're not being vulnerable with your friends, then they're going to assume that you're just fine.
Exactly.
They may not know that, when you're sitting at home with your thoughts, that you're feeling awful and you don't have to put on. And if you do have a friend that you doesn't want to hear it or says you have to put on a brave face, go find somebody else, because they're not going to be there for you when you need them. Well, thank you. Yeah. This was such a great conversation. I think that I hope men listen and pay attention. I mean, this could apply to women as well, but I really think men need to be okay with saying they're not okay and to seek help and to do the work. I think that could be the theme of this podcast episode is do the work, because a lot of, which applies to a lot of things, but when you change your mindset and work on yourself, then you can feel better and go on and not, think that divorce is the worst thing that's ever happened to you.
I'm glad you focused on men. And I just want to say this, in my book, I have a section that's specifically women. Here's everything you need to know about men. And then men, here's everything you need to know about women. And this is so important because, using the analogy from before, men are from, Mars, women are from Venus, we think differently.
Yes.
And if we can at least have a better understanding of how each other's brains work and our love languages and how we like to communicate, well, if we seek that knowledge, then we can have a stronger relationship and we can communicate better. And then, if you decide to divorce, you are in a more level playing field with not nearly as many landmines to mediate.
Yeah.
Which will save time and money and hurt.
Yes. And I love that you have in your book, which is available on Amazon,
Yep.
Correct? Okay. And the workbook is available on Amazon as well, right?
Both of them.
Okay. And I will include that in the show notes. But I love that you put in there, so men can understand women and women can understand men, because that is a problem that we don't, I know men definitely do not understand this, and I get it because we are a little bit complicated, but it does help to try to understand this. So in addition to your book and your workbook and your work as a coach, you also started a podcast not too long ago focused on divorce, which you spoke a little bit about. And is that on all the, Spotify?
Yeah. It's on all the platforms. It's called The Conscious Divorce because I don't want you just going through divorce. I want you to consciously go through divorce so that you can consciously uncouple.
Quote Gwyneth Paltrow and was it Chris Martin? Is that the consciously uncoupling?
Yeah.
She's an interesting person. And Chris Martin, I think, caused a divorce. Well, his band caused a divorce last year, which is not his fault. Those people should have known better. So in addition to your podcast and your book and the work you do, you also have a support group for men, which is an 8-week program. Do you want to talk briefly? It's on your website. I'll include that link too. You want to talk briefly about how that works and what you do?
Yeah, it's interesting. When I was going through my own divorce, I tried to go to some support groups, and some were very good and helpful, and others I felt worse leaving, than when I started. They were just so depressing, so I wanted to put together a support group of men who really want to work and move through divorce and, become whole and hopefully, make their kids and their ex-spouse whole. It's 8 weeks on the website. It kind of, goes through the structure. Every week, there's psychoeducation and learning. There's a little bit of homework, nothing, overly consuming, but it's an opportunity to work on yourself, or as we say, do the work. And it's an opportunity to meet other men who are going through the same thing and, building new relationships. And it's virtual, so it makes it really easy. And, if we find we have people in the same cities, then maybe we'll have some get-togethers. And I plan on doing some mixed groups and groups for women as well.
Awesome. That's great. So all your information will be in the show notes. If people men or women want to reach out to you, where do you want to send them first? Where's the best place to connect with you that you spend most time on?
Absolutely. So, if you go to the website, it's www.reclaimandreboot.me. You can set up a free 30-minute consultation. There's no pressure to become a client. I just want to hear your story and see how I can help you. There's lots of free tools on the website to download. You can always call my mobile at 404-353-5175. Text me, and I'll respond as quickly as I can. And divorce isn't the end of the world. And sometimes it's, a blank canvas to design the most incredible life. So try and look at it that way, but make sure you do right by your ex and by your kids, and life moves on. And I'll finish with this one quote, which I really love. It's, yesterday is history, tomorrow is a mystery, and all you have is the now. So, tomorrow is not promised, and you want to enjoy each and every moment that you're alive on this earth.
Yes, I think that's a perfect way to end this episode. Thank you again, Justin, for being on it. This was so informative and interesting, and I learned some, info about men and divorce that I think I will use if I start dating again. But thank you so much. And again, all of his information will be in the show notes, so you can reach out with him, buy his book, listen to his podcast, and work with him. Thank you so much to Justin Milrad for coming on the podcast. I hope that all the men listening got a lot out of it. Definitely go check out his books and workbook. His podcast, The Conscious Divorce, on everywhere podcasts are available. And connect with him if you are thinking about getting divorced, going through it, or been through it, and you would love to work with someone who can help you move on with your life and get in a better place. Because as he said, you have to do the work, and divorce is not the end. So This will conclude our 2-part series on divorce. If you have any thoughts or questions, as always, you can email me in the show notes. And if you like today's episodes or any of the episodes, please rate and review the podcast. It really does help people discover it. And until next time, my fellow Gen Xers, don't you forget about me, because I will not forget about you.